I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people and their ancestors as traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, and recognise their unique contribution to our environmental and cultural heritage, past, present and future. I extend our respect to all Indigenous people and their elders in attendance today. My name is Jerry Stoker. I'm a centenary professor at the Institute for Governance, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on smart governance, which focuses on desirable futures for Australia. Our particular focus today is on the impact of digital change on public service delivery, and in particular what Australian citizens say about what they want and why. Our conversation will centre on the launch of the latest Telstra Connecting Government report, Delivering Digital Government, the Australian Public Scorecard, which was conducted by Jack Dan, Mark Evans and Max Hrubka. Jack and Mark will be presenting the key findings. So let me just briefly introduce the both of them. Dr. Jack Dan is Director of Global Foresight at Telstra. I said to Jack when he described his new title to me that I quite fancy being a Professor of Global Hindsight, in that seemed like quite an easy position to have. Director of Global Foresight, a little bit more tricky. Jack has responsibility across strategy and thought leadership, capability development, business relationships and engagement for the government sector. He also leads Telstra's premier research and thought leadership program, the Connected Government program, and he's involved in assisting government leaders address key issues in public policy. And Jack is going to be our first speaker today. The second speaker is my colleague, Professor Mark Evans, who should hopefully be a familiar face to most of the people in this audience. He's Director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis. I have written several things with him. He is also an author in his own right with a broad range of books and articles on various aspects of Australian governance and politics. I think we're going to have a really interesting session, and now I'm delighted to hand over to Jack to make the initial presentation.
So first I'll start with another disclaimer. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because I really enjoy the research, and the Institute for Governance has been a really great partner for our research program. That being said, I'm not here for the flattery. So my title is actually Head of Global Foresight as opposed to Director. It is a director level position, but we're moving away from kind of labels to more inclusive titles. That's the first one. And I think at some stage I was advertised as being a professor. So if anyone is here in the room because they're expecting to hear from a real professor, Jack Dan, I'm sorry to disappoint. We've got probably about 25 to 30 minutes for Mark and I to give you a bit of a rundown through this research report and pick up the findings. And I'm going to try and do it in a way that is, here we are, keeps going. I'm going to try and do it in a way that is not necessarily very interactive, but very high level. And that's because while we've been running this program at Telstra for about 6 years, if we are to go down into the detail, it can become quite technical. So I'm going to try and keep it reasonably high level and maybe in a way that we can all relate to the findings. So let me tell you first why we're doing this. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we have tried to get a sense of what the Australian public expects, wants, and does with government services delivered at a state and federal level. And what we have found as we did the kind of the yearly surveys and investigation was that from year to year, there were quite a number of things that stayed reasonably the same or reasonably on trend, whereas other things were evolving according to a number of factors. And one of the important factors that were influencing the way that people regard government services is not surprisingly what's happening in the private sector, and again, not surprisingly what's happening on the technology front. So we tried over the entire period to develop a methodology which allows for some comparisons, and also has the necessary academic rigor, which is where IPGA comes in order to make sure that this study offers the possibility of further drilling down of the findings for the people that are interested in doing so. So what I'm going to cover today are the nerdy bits, which are some comparisons between the public sector and the private sector in the eyes of the Australian public. So what do we think about the relative performance or how we regard public sector services compared with the private sector ones? Then we're going to drill a little bit down and look at the different ways in which those services are being delivered and what is the role of the different channels or the different ways that those services get to the public. Then we're going to drill a little bit further down into online, and that will become clear why. And then I'll hand over to Mark, who is going to talk about the more interesting bits. And what I mean by that is the appetite for innovation in a policy sense. So if we take a bit of a step back and we think about service delivery as being essentially the domain of the bureaucrats, the domain of the public service, and the policy as being the domain of the political class, and the debates that are being had there, Mark is going to cover the exciting bits of the political class, and I'm going to continue to cover the public servants. So let's start with a bit of a look at how the public regards services delivered by the public sector, by the bureaucrats. Right? And what we tried to do was essentially measure 5 dimensions in the case of the public sector and then 4 dimensions in the case of the private sector. The one that's missing when we do the comparison between the public and the private is the second one from the left, which says work with other public services. In general, I think a good saying about the public service is that the competitive advantage of the public sector is collaboration. In the private sector, we don't really have, generally speaking, as a way of going to market, that same advantage. We tend to collaborate, but not in that kind of mandated way that is possible in the public sector. Otherwise, we risk collusion and other kind of similar behaviors. So, if we're looking across the 5 dimension, we're probably looking at about a 20 to 25% meeting of expectation across those 5 dimensions. Whether it is understanding the needs, which is mostly around the 15 to 16%, whether it is listening to the preferences of the public in terms of how the services are being delivered, whether it is offering a personalized service. And if you are to reflect on your own experiences with public sector delivered services, it would be interesting to see where you find yourself and how much, for example, you're involved in the decision making. You get a personalized service, or the agencies listen to your preferences. If we skip to the private sector, the picture is slightly better. So understanding the needs, listening to preferences, personalized services, and involving decision making, it is a bit higher by about 10 to 15%. But there is a flip side of that. And the flip side is that, as you can see, we have great expectations, both from the public sector and from the private sector. Because essentially, apart from probably a 39% across listening to preferences and involving in decision making, more than 50% of people or 50% of expectations are really not being met. And I think an interesting question to ponder on is, why are people saying that? So if we are to do a direct comparison between the public sector and the private sector, things become a bit more clear. that big light blue segment in the middle are people who are saying that, look, if we are looking at private sector or public sector, things are pretty much the same, right? So about half of the experiences are the same, and that's whether it takes place by post, online, via email interactions, mobile apps, in persons, or telephone. And you can see the different percentages there. What's interesting is that if you ignore that wide band in the middle, then it becomes quite clear that that many more people have a better view or a better opinion about the private sector compared with the public sector. Hence that gap of expectations. Things get even more interesting when you're trying to do the same comparison between sectors at federal versus state government levels. And the findings here are somewhat similar in that an even greater proportion of people say that, well, services are pretty much the same, whether I get them from New South Wales government or federal government or ACT government or federal government or so on. They're pretty much similar. But again, state government fares much better in the differences compared with the federal government. And again, the question would be, why is that the case? If we accept that private sector is better than public sector, okay, let's say that the private sector can turn that customer experience into a competitive advantage, and maybe you don't necessarily have the same drivers or the same investment in the public sector. But why do you think that this is the same experience when you compare state with federal? So let's look now a little bit more at the role of technology across these services. So one interesting stat is the fact that MyGov enjoys a significant amount of take-up across the Australian public, followed by the Do Not Call register, followed by eTax, which obviously now requires MyTax in order to complete, followed by the personal e-health record. And then between all of those, there's a big distance down to the local, state, or territory government portal. So think the likes of Service New South Wales and similar. And that would say that at a high level, people should be quite familiar with the services provided by the federal government, and therefore maybe should have a better experience of them. If we're looking at the activities that drive usage, we have tried to group them across a number of dimensions that were favoring both somewhat equally both federal and state government. And one of the things that became quite clear early on was the fact that online, so internet web presence, was an important channel, an important way, or a majority way in which quite a number of activities were being undertaken, from paying bills, fines or penalties, tax assessments, government benefits, government services, requesting information about government services, and so on and so forth, and then it trails off. The words, and probably one of the ones that has probably least online presence now is seeking help or advice for public health care. And you're thinking about that, well, it makes sense that most of us would want to be in person when we're seeking advice about our health today, but that may not necessarily be the case going forward. And this is what we have found. So when we looked at what happened, essentially we asked questions about what happened in the past, what happens today, and what is your expectation as a member of the public going forward. We saw that the rates of taking or accessing services in person decrease, whereas the expectation of services being available online increased significantly. And this is very obvious in this particular graph. Now, you would say that this is fairly easy for a straight-up transaction like claiming medical expenses or Medicare. But look what happens when the same comparison is being made across that last element where online penetration is very small today, which is seeking help or advice from public health care services. And in that case, as you can see, people expect that they'll continue to do a significant amount of the interaction in person, but look at that graph around online and the expectations in that space. So what do people think about the government services that are being delivered online today? Most of them have a pretty good opinion about them. So, you know, everything blue on that graph starts from kind of fair to being good or being very good. So people generally like what is it that they're getting through the online channels. But if we drill a little bit closer and deeper, we see that there are both things that people appreciate, like convenience, the quick and easy access of services, but they also appreciate other services which are in person for either their ability to deliver or ability to feel local and part of that community. And there are also a number of negative statements that people associate with the different channels. And if we are to look at two separate negative statements, the first one is, you know, what people consider to be frustrating in accessing services. And you can see that the big red part there, so 57%, is telephone as a channel for getting services. So people are getting really, really frustrated when they have to call an agency, call a department, and try to get to the bottom of whatever problem they're having. That's followed by in-person as a channel. Again, people find it frustrating for the long delays, and then followed by post online and so on. So that is quite a negative sentiment. Another sentiment that we decided to put up is a channel of last resort. Right? And if you think about it, you know, when you're trying to solve a problem, what are kind of the choices you have? What it is, I'm going to hop first online and see if I can solve it. And if not, I'm going to escalate it to a phone call. And if not, I'm going to walk into an office. Last resort is pretty much reflecting that. So 39% of people would consider showing up to an agency or to a shop front in person as a last resort, followed by telephoning or picking up the phone as a last resort, and followed by doing things through the mail as a last resort. What's interesting and what's the difference between frustrating, which is clearly a negative sentiment, and last resort is last resort has both an effort dimension, so how much we have to put in order to get what we want, but also has an effectiveness dimension. So we're going to put it out, we're going to delay that escalation going in person, but we hope that when we do so, it's finally going to be fixed, whatever it is we're talking about. So if this is the way that the Australian public regards government services, you'd think that we are a pretty pessimistic or skeptical bunch of people in terms of what we expect from the government and, more importantly, our expectations of the government's capability to deliver that. But I think when we move away from the actual experience of service delivery and we start investigating the realm of possibilities, the realm of policy, we find that actually Australians are a pretty optimistic mob. Over to you.
So I'm going to focus now on two broad questions, really. The first question is, does the Australian public have a capacity or an appetite for innovation? And then secondly, how is the Commonwealth Government in particular responding to that opportunity for innovation at present? Now, I should also say that, because I know that the slides are difficult to follow on such a small screen, that we'll give you the link to where the report's available. So on the first page of this, there's a link to the Telstra website, but it's also available on the Institute for Governance website as well under reports. Okay, under reports. So if you just Google IGPA reports, it comes up as the first report there, and then that links into the Telstra website. Okay. Well, first of all, there are two key findings in relation to this aspect of the survey, and neither are particularly surprising. The first headline is that Australians expect to have the same quality of interaction with public services that they have with their smartphone providers or the Apple experience. They actually expect the Apple experience increasingly of public services. And of course that creates very significant challenges for public organisations, because it may be that public organisations are never going to be able to meet that particular challenge in terms of the quality of service provision. At the same time, it also demonstrates that there's very significant scope there for innovation, because if Apple is the sort of the philosopher's stone in terms of innovation, then clearly there's a lot of scope there for public organisations to do policy and services differently. Then the other dimension to this is that obviously we conducted this survey in the context of a period of very significant mistrust between government and the citizen. And you've heard me talking about this before, so I won't repeat all the data, but you're all aware that in terms of reporting, quantitative reporting on Australians' attitudes towards their political system, those attitudes have really reached a low point. Particularly over the last 10 years, there's been a period of very steady decline since the end of the Howard period. And that decline is getting steeper and steeper. We know at the same time that this is a global phenomenon. So 75% of governments around the world, their citizens don't trust them, 75%. But we also know that the majority of those governments have experienced the worst excesses of the global financial crisis, and we've had 25 years of economic growth. Okay, so there's something strange happening within the Australian context, and this is particularly reflected in low confidence in government to deliver on core tasks. So there's only actually one area of public policy where Australians now still, the majority of Australians have confidence in government of whatever colour, and that's in relation to defence and security. In every other area, including the economy now, the management of the economy, the majority of Australians have low confidence in government to solve key public policy problems. However, there is very significant public appetite for policy innovation. So what we did in the survey is we identified a range of quite radical policy changes, and these related to a range of things from changes to the Australian Constitution, to things like using behavioural insights in public policy, to introducing 100-point identity checks as an automatic replacement for a digital identity, a whole raft of really quite thorny and what we thought would be quite problematic areas of reform. And you see that the vast majority of Australians embrace innovation and change. Now, we also conducted this survey in the aftermath of the e-census crisis. So again, we were expected there to be an e-census impact on our findings, and there wasn't. Right? And there's something there to be learnt, actually, I think, for the public service, that actually you don't necessarily have to have a knee-jerk reaction in relation to those particular processes, because there's the expectation that when you try something new, first time round, there may be some issues. You know, there may be some problems, but it's, of course, how you manage the communications aspect of that is the key. And perhaps that's where the key lessons are around the management of public expectations and the communication strategy that flowed from those issues. And that's probably an area where we do need to learn much more from the private sector, because as you know from your own personal experiences with Telstra. Telstra have had a very bumpy couple of years in relation to that, but they've been able to manage public expectations pretty well, really, in the circumstances, if you can compare some of the issues that you've had with the e-census issue. Anyway, so obviously, obviously for those of people who are interested in public sector reform, this is, really quite promising stuff. I should also say that there also isn't, as you can see, a strong generational dimension to that. So young people and old people equally embrace the prospect of innovation and change. Okay, so we've also been doing some additional work as well as part of the Connecting Government series on how well prepared Commonwealth Government is for a period of disruption. And again, you can see this report on our website. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this for too long because we want to get to a discussion. But essentially what we were asked to do by Telstra and this piece of work was sort of co-designed with key people in the Commonwealth Public Service, was to ask the question, well, how prepared is Commonwealth Government for a period of digital disruption? Secondly, what are the major barriers to change? Thirdly, from where is Commonwealth Government drawing lessons? And then finally, where is the glitter in terms of digital change? Where can we find real quality examples of digital change occurring? Now, again, the context to this, you'll all remember, was Malcolm Turnbull's speech in the Great Hall almost 2 years ago now, where he basically challenged the Australian Public Service to be a catalyst or an exemplar of digital change, and he made this clarion call for departments and agencies to walk the walk and talk the talk in terms of digital imagination and the use of digital imagination. And what our research demonstrates is that we've had previous cycles of innovation. Since I've been in Australia, there's been sort of 3 cycles of innovation that have been partially linked to digital change. So that's since 2009. But what is qualitatively different about this process of change is the political leadership, the commitment of the political class to change, combined with commitment within the Secretary's Board to affect digital change as well. And that's created a qualitatively different environment in my view. And this slide just gives you an indication of the scope of change at the moment in relation to what I call, and my co-author Patrick Dunleavy calls, digital era governance. So if you look down the vertical axis in terms of areas of innovation, we distinguish between what we call digital era governance 1 enablers. So that is basically where we're seeing the move towards digital first online service provision. We're seeing the increasing use of user design, right, and co-design through organizations like the Digital Transformation Agency. And we're seeing the reintegration of information management systems through shared services, etc. Digital era governance enablers are basically about embracing the Internet of Things and high-tech defense enablers that fully exploit the opportunities afforded by the social web or build capability in big data analytics or artificial intelligence. And then at the same time, we also identify the development of what are called governance enablers. These are institutional mechanisms to enable and exploit digitization, right? And actually, over a very short period of time, as you can see from the range of programs, services, projects, and institutional venues that have been created, there has really been a very significant process of transformation initiated. Now, in terms of the outcomes of this process of change, it's early doors, although clearly the opposition over the next few months is going to start to raise questions about the outcomes that have emerged from things like the National Innovation and Science Agenda, right? So watch this space. But at the same time, we've seen the delivery of a whole range of new experimental methods for doing services and policies, and a profound challenge to orthodox policy making. So the dominance of economics as the determining way of doing public policy and delivering services has been very significantly challenged. And now we're seeing the embracing of co-design, the use of big data analytics to inform real-time decision-making in a whole range of different ways. So the scope of this process of change, I think historically we will view as a watershed in Australian governance. There has been some major changes. Now, that's not to say that all departments and agencies have been impacted by these broader processes of change in the same way. What we're seeing is an even impact in development. So those departments and agencies with significant citizen interactions, such as the Tax Office, Human Services, those agencies are moving forward very, very quickly. So they're moving beyond what I call Digital Era Governance 1. So the classic example there is the use of drone technology now to monitor ecosystems or transport systems to generate big data sets. And the work of Data 61 in this area has been very, very significant. We've obviously moved beyond the fast gate technology now that's associated with Digital Era Governance 1. And we're heading profoundly and really quite quickly towards this notion of a robot state. And probably one of the most interesting examples of this that is being developed at the moment is Nadia. Now, Nadia is an avatar public servant. She's AI public servant who works for the National Disability Insurance Agency. She was created by Dr. Mark Sager from the University of Auckland. He was an Oscar winner for Avatar, King Kong and Spider-Man 2. He's the creator of Baby X, and essentially what he's done here is that he's created, with a group of Australians experiencing various forms of disability, an emotionally intelligent public servant who will act as a call centre for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And of course, the key insight here is that as long as you have enough cloud storage, you can have literally thousands of Nadias responding in a consistent way to the needs and interests of citizens. Now, of course, this is a pilot scheme, but it's had incredible feedback. But it opens up clearly major questions, really, ethical questions about the use of AI in public service delivery. But what we do know is that citizens trust Nadia. Citizens trust Nadia far more than the human interfaces that they engage with in service delivery. So there could potentially be a tipping point here. And certainly it's going to be one of the huge moral questions of our time. So look, some key conclusions just to end with. What this report demonstrates is that there is a sustained willingness amongst the Australian citizenry to use online services and a preference for online services over other delivery channels. There's a perception that the public sector is still perceived to be behind the private sector. However, regardless of whether it's delivered by the public or the private sector, they want more online service delivery. So even perceptions of public online service delivery is pretty strong in the great scheme of things. Not as strong as in the private sector, but still very strong. Now, obviously, this is happening in a context where confidence in government is very low, but where there's a belief that digitisation could be used as an effective tool for rebuilding trust with the citizenry, given positive attitudes towards online government services, and given that Australians are giving a big thumbs up to experimentation and policy innovation. And there is significant evidence of innovation now occurring in public service delivery. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack and Mark. It would be lovely, I think, for people to have a chance now to ask questions or raise any comments that they have. So who would like to go first?
Thank you very much. That was really interesting stuff. The environment issues that were raised there, that very low level of interaction, was there any teasing out between state government environment and federal government environment? Because, of course, there's a significant difference in terms of the rights the Constitution gives to both of these levels of government.
Which one of you want to have a first go at that one?
Yeah, look, I can answer that straight away. So we've only got so we did booster samples on state and territory responses, but it was still basically about the broad issue. It wasn't really about who does what better in terms of different levels of governance. That wasn't really our focus. Our focus was on how much confidence do you have in government. And this is based upon the sort of the perception that most citizens actually don't distinguish between different levels of governance. They don't even distinguish quite often, unless you ask them directly, between public servants, for example, and politicians. They just see government. And that's why this trust issue becomes so important, you see, because the whole of government is contaminated by the problem of low trust. Now, however, in another survey that we did actually drill down in more detail to get a sense of differences. And the differences are that local government actually performs much stronger than every other level of governance, not surprisingly, because it's viewed to be the most immediate level of governance to the people. So in these areas, for example, the ACT government always does very well as a territory government in comparison to other levels of governance. And metropolitan governments always do much better. State governments, less better, but Commonwealth government always comes out worse. But, you know, these are perceptions, and they're explicable in a whole range of different ways.
I think one of the things with what Mark alluded to is the proximity to service and also the frequency of service. So if you think about it, if you have one interaction a year as an individual with a taxation office, and that interaction goes bad for one reason or another, you're likely to say that, you know, they're hopeless, right? And that forms your view. So the fewer interactions, the more critical the quality of each interaction becomes in shaping up your entire perception or your entire opinion about the services. And the state governments have the luxury of having more immediate and more frequent services if you're thinking about health, if you're thinking about transport, education, and the like.
With a greater movement towards delivering digital government, what about the digital divide? And in your survey, what sort of sample were you mainly dealing with? Middle class people, you know, or were you taking into account different social sectors?
So this survey did not specifically identify the issue of digital divide, but we have another piece of work at Telstra which looks specifically at that. And I think what we have noticed over the last couple of years is that that digital divide becomes more and more critical as we're looking at digital government. In other words, if in the past digital used to be one of the channels, and maybe that channel was relatively more convenient or offered a better experience to the public compared to other channels available from the same from the same service. going forward, if we're taking into account the fact that people generally want more digital services, then that digital literacy gap becomes a critical issue. Because essentially we're saying that if we're going down that path and we don't make any other channels available for the public, people will miss on things because they're not able to access them. And this is something that we highlighted over the last 2 years of that digital inclusion report.
So if you, but also the earlier report that we did, we do have some data on this. And look, there is still a set of marginalised groups in relation to this, and that largely relates to the digital literacy
digital
piece.
inclusion, yeah.
However, up to 84% of Australians now transact on a regular basis online. That's 84%. So I'm not denying that there isn't pockets of marginalisation, and obviously there's a number of strategies, including in relation to closing the gap, that's trying to deal with that issue. But in terms of digital participation, rates of participation in Australia are very, very high in comparison even to other Western democracies.
And I think from a service provider point of view, you would expect that the more resources can be freed up by the use of technology, at least some of those resources could be put in to actually deal and offer a much better experience to those people that may be at the risk of missing out.
That's the theory, and if you look at, it is well, that's in formal terms, and that's what we were told a lot during. So we, as part of the earlier project, I did about 50 elite interviews with departmental secretaries, including in all the big service departments, and their view was that yes, this will create scope for targeted service provision to support, those people in real need. So that was their expectation. We shall see whether it works out like that in practice when you've got ASL caps, etc.
Okay, another question, just at the back again there.
Yes, I'm just wondering whether there's been any attempt to evaluate the use of the avatar as a means of interrogating data. I'm referring specifically to the My Health record and the fact that people get so frustrated at trying to get out anything useful from what's already there. So while there are over 2 million My Health records created, the number that are actually being used is like 100,000 or something. However, if the avatar with NDIS is working to make the information held in that system more useful, could it be then applied to the My Health record, and how would you study that, and what are people's expectations in that field?
I can take this one, yeah. I'm not aware of any plans to make this specific avatar, able to interrogate the My Health record. I think there would be a number of privacy and other regulatory obstacles to be or barriers to be dealt with before something like that was to be made possible. From a technology point of view, there is nothing stopping it. So if you think about it, the avatar is able to essentially present a visual form to a program that in turn interprets both verbal cues and non-verbal cues. So behavioral cues in terms of the people that they're interacting with, and then both find the answer and, more importantly, articulate the answer in a way that responds to both those verbal and non-verbal cues. And that is particularly important with people that have a range of disabilities, and they need a much more tailored interaction than you would normally get from a stock standard, call agent. The back end of Nadia and a number of other avatars that are now springing up in both across the public sector and the private sector is essentially a learning, artificial intelligence learning machine. And depending on the data that you choose to make available to that machine will be able to interpret that data and then provide you an answer or address you by using that data. So technology is, from a technological point of view, it's possible. I'm afraid there would be other more complicating factors before that was to become reality.
It was one of the more interesting conversations I've ever had was when we went to the launch of Nadia. And people were asked the question about how you could translate this technology into different areas. The scary bit was one of the interventions that said, oh, you could use this in theatre of wars, to improve decision making. And I thought, oh my God, that's exactly where you wouldn't want Nadia, because you would obviously do a calculation about acceptable levels of casualties. However, we could certainly replace politicians with avatars. Or I mean, this is, yeah.
And look, on that front, there are a number of AI engines that are there and are currently being used to improve decision making in that kind of a health clinical environment. I don't think, again, going back to both regulatory and kind of ethical issues, I don't think we're quite ready to say, you, Mr. Robot, take the decision for us. But it's definitely there to inform our decision-making capability.
But in terms of public engagement, on a serious note, I was actually being serious about the politicians, right? That was basically how you can create online engagements, right? In which you can aggregate preferences in a community, right? And have a meaningful conversation, right, with politicians using this type of artificial intelligence. So instead of having to get the whole community in a room together, right, you could use survey data to build up a representative samples of views on a particular issue, right, and have meaningful engagement in that way. So actually AI potentially brings direct democracy closer to reality. That's just one example. There's lots and lots of other examples of where you can see that, literally the sky's the limit in terms of this type of technology, but of course you've got all the moral issues, the Skynet issues that surround this for those Terminator aficionados out there. Potentially, yeah, as politicians can.
Within 24 hours, though, they'll take it down with the raving
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, technology will continue to evolve and will continue to improve on that front. Some of the earlier attempts at neural networks, there is a classic example of, a new learning machine system is being fed all kind of images, and it's asked at some point in time to recognize a penguin. And it is presented the image of a penguin, and the machine says, yes, there is about an 89% chance that this image is a penguin. It is then presented the image of a car, and it says there is about a 74% chance that this image is a penguin. So, it's not infallible.
Hi, sorry. The response to rebuilding trust is not Nadia, it's her traits, which builds trust. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, because that was one thing. And secondly, so it's not so much about digital being a way to rebuild trust, it's the traits and characteristics of that interaction
very good point.
which builds trust. The second thing, when you ask the questions around trust in government services, was there any distinguishing or any way of, was there a separation between politics and government, and was that clear?
Not in this survey, but in the other surveys that we've done, there is.
I think I'll qualify that. Those latent dispositions, I think they were quite clear government or government inclusive of political and the bureaucratic class. When we looked at services, we didn't explicitly say ignore politicians, but what we tried to do was to make it absolutely clear that we're talking about specific services. And those services were requesting information, paying bills, getting benefits, asking for, accessing transport, doing things in health. So we tried to make things quite well defined in a service delivery way to try and remove it from that kind of, blob of decision making that may include both politicians and the public sector.
And just one last point, I suppose, on the artificial intelligence in particular. Sorry, I've forgotten her name. Nadia. That's where kind of we're at now. And I met up with a humanoid social robot called Nadia in Singapore. That was freaky. It was really kind of scary how this robot all of a sudden became a human. Presumably, the better AI gets, the more human it becomes, and therefore the more fallible it becomes, the more prone to making errors it becomes, the less trustworthy it becomes too.
To a certain degree, you're probably right. So there is, in the research around avatars and around also kind of human representations in the online world, there's been a fair amount of research done to identify the point at which likeness of human form in an online environment, in a created environment, becomes creepy, becomes essentially so close to looking like a human that it generates a response of revulsion and pushback. And there are a number of research projects that are looking at how they get around that. But you wouldn't find it implausible, for example, to think that in the future, as both the technology and then the computing power evolves, Jack should be able to more or less shape the avatar that he's dealing with in government, and may, further down the track, have his own avatar that knows Jack across a number of years, and understands what, my life circumstances, the way I'm transitioning across different services, and potentially what else I may be benefiting from at one point or another in my life. That sounds a little bit scary in a way, but by the same token, that idea of being able to offer a truly personalized service to people and scaling that up and having, hundreds or thousands of Nadia being able to talk and engage at the same time, there is a positive side to that.
So in the Nadia pilots, what was particularly interesting about them is, in contrast to the call centre pilots, is that in the call centre people are given a certain amount of time that they can spend on the phone with each participant from each benefit claimant, whereas there was no time limit in terms of Nadia. And on average, it was 1 hour and 20 minutes people were spending with Nadia, right? And then of course, so we asked, remember, well, does that mean Nadia is actually giving therapy, emotional support? And that's where it started to get sort of grey area. I mean, she has those traits of listening, of empathy, right? And because of that, people wanted to stay with her. So the big issue is that a problem?
And by the way, on Nadia, there are
morally, is that a problem?
I think you can go online on YouTube and type Nadia avatar and see a little demo of it working.
So you get straight into that whole dependency type questions there, really. Which, if it was a real human being, that would be perceived to be an issue. But because she's an AI, it's not perceived to have the same problems.
In terms of the service delivery issues, you put up, I think, 5 or 6 different issues. And the lowest ratings or positive support for those seem to be in areas where personal information was being taken and used for a purpose. Have you clustered those service delivery areas to find out that?
Yeah, so those are the constituent elements of the scorecard. So if you go to the report, yes, we have done that, because obviously the idea is to have time series on those different dimensions of the scorecard, so that we can assess progress over time. So I encourage you to go and have a look at the report, which has been ably compiled by Max, who's just sitting next to you. So if you've got any questions about that, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I will come to you in a moment, but there's another lady that wanted to ask. Can you just wait for the microphone to arrive? Sorry.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. And it's heartening to know that the take-up of digitisation across Australia is so high and so positive. Now, can we expect that as a result there will be increased pressure on political elites to lift their game? Because it would seem that that is likely to flow.
That's a question for you.
And Max, actually. So this is sort of the connective argument, which is, yeah. Okay, I'll give you my problem. Max, you might want to respond to this as well. So my approach to this is that I don't think digital democracy has matured to a degree where digital pressure is actually being transmitted through the political system and is leading to outcomes. So I think there's a disconnection between, for example, online activism and the response of the political elite to online activism. And that's largely because the online activists tend to communicate with people like them. You get a siloing effect, right, in terms of political participation through the web. So you go to people like you who share the same views as you, and you're not expecting. So in contrast, if you thought about traditional forms of participation, right, where you contact your MP or you develop a campaign or you petition directly to the political system, a lot of online activism is still disconnected from traditional forms of political participation. So the key challenge for online communities is how can they translate their activism in such a way that they compel politicians to respond, right? And then B, if I was organising if I was an independent parliamentarian, right, seeking to gain comparative advantage over the main political parties, this would be my key focus of attack, how I could build coalition and alliances with online communities, right? So, in a sense, what I'm saying is that mainstream political parties are going to need to respond to this to stay in power, right? But at the same time, online communities need to slightly refocus the nature of their politics to win the war of ideas in mainstream politics, because they're still disconnected.
So generally, if I am to make a broader observation, digital is still being used as one of the channels of delivery, but it doesn't necessarily change fundamentally the way that the approach to delivery is being designed. It is essentially one, let's say, oversimplifying, but one approach which is then articulated across a number of channels, as opposed to taking that, the opportunities of digital at the core of how you structure the engagement. And I think that's something that you're alluding to, because you can get to, let's say, Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and build a campaign around it, but it's still designed as a traditional campaign to be operating in that medium. There isn't that kind of two-way interface. There isn't the use of data in a consistent way to inform the evolution of policy ideas and so on.
Max, maybe you want to come in here, because literally Max is kind of the world expert on this. I'm not joking. He publishes in the highest impact international journals in the world on this topic.
Mark, that's fine. I think we should encourage Max to say something. There is another question there, but should we get Max on first, because that follows on with the issue about politics, but we should give time to the other question as well.
I broadly agree with Mark here.
Well, that's a relief.
It is. I mean, he's not wrong. Except for this idea that online communities sort of have to change the way in which they engage, the way they do things. And that sort of suggests that the everyday citizen is capable of such a reflexive change. One point of view would be that the proliferation of new technology and online environments has fundamentally changed the relationship between citizen and democracy and citizen and political authority, the way in which they engage with democracy and also the way in which they view politics. And in this way, to suggest they're moving forward, and what you are suggesting there is that they have to come back, that they have to make their way backwards. And the question would be, is that even possible? It would be, say, for government, political authorities and democracy perhaps to change and move and match pace with a changing society. But to ask a society which has been fundamentally altered to move back again may be unrealistic. And in this way, one could question the separation between citizen and authority, between the expectations of what an everyday citizen, has of democracy. Everyday citizens see themselves as engaged. They're consuming political content, they're engaging online, and even though it's different than traditional avenues such as voting or contacting local members or petitions and such, they still satisfy this sense of democratic duty. They feel as if they're doing things, and yet they're not seeing that connection between their action and involvement and interest in politics and change at the bigger level. And so that separation, that divide between citizen and action is a real big issue.
Well, thank you very much for an interesting presentation there. Given that connected digital government is aiming to break down competing silos of information, or those silos of information that are in health, different service delivery areas, linking various services such as health and welfare together, and also at bringing the government and private sector providers together to get better citizen service delivery outcomes. How has the privacy debate changed and is changing this, and to what extent does trust play a role in that change within the privacy debate?
It's an interesting question. Can I ask you to reply relatively briefly, though, because we're a bit pressed for
So
time.
let's see if we can go to some of the actual findings there. So what we have found is that over the last few years, the concerns around privacy and security of personal data have actually increased. You can attribute that either to an increased media or public debate around privacy and security. You can attribute that to some of the fairly high-profile failings or media coverage attributed to various technology projects failing or having issues across both public and private sector. But more importantly, I think we can attribute that to the fact that there is an emerging awareness among the public of the fact that their personal data has significant value. And the fact that, at least in so far as private sector is concerned, we have now an emergence of new providers that are willing to be more benevolent in terms of what they do with the data, and make a virtue of the fact that they don't necessarily suck all the data and give you no visibility or control. I think that issue of data and privacy and the value of it is increasing in profile. So I think that will continue to be the case. Europe has started addressing that with the General Data Protection Regulation, which essentially says or mandates that the data is owned by the customer as opposed to by a particular company or another. And some of you may be aware that whatever company now in Australia does business with Europe from May next year will have to comply with those regulations. And there's a wide expectation that a similar regime will come down under. So my sense is that the awareness around the value will see a response in the way that the regulation will change in that space.
Yeah, so, sorry, we have somebody who knows a lot about what's happening in Commonwealth government around the privacy and information area. because I know that there's a lot happening at the moment, particularly in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
If you wish to complete my answer or provide an alternative.
But if you took as Grant, and you're not here as a member of the department, I know, but there is a lot of work going on around this area at the moment, isn't there? Could you just comment on where we're at?
Well, there is a lot of work going on, and there's also work going on between the Commonwealth and jurisdictions. There's also work going on between different privacy commissioners. There's been a lot of stuff recently released. The Australian Office of Privacy Commissioner has released some new guidelines and things, and they're working with state ones. There's also about linking data. The first non-Commonwealth data integrator has been approved. So there are things like that going on, but that's working in conjunction with the Office of Privacy Commissioner and looking at privacy impact assessments and things like that.
I just want to raise asking for the experiment or the survey result, because the online survey, and especially the monkey surveys, things like really fluid, and it can be fluctuate too much, and then it's really dynamic, and then it's which some key political events happens, it can reverse the result. Just like Donald Trump win the election, or currently we got a dual citizenship saga. So if you do the survey, it might be, the result might be really different. And how can you assess those kind of your research?
Well, I have to say, it's a good question. I suppose the only defence that we would have is that we have time series on all of these questions, so we're able to triangulate.
The sample methodology to 2,000 people that we chose were consistent with the ABS methodology for actually providing population samples and census. So that's one. The timing of the survey was chosen in such a way that theoretically, at least, all the significant influence from preceding events should have subsided, and there was nothing actually happening during the 2 weeks or whatever it took us for the survey. So there wasn't any particular things to influence the public sentiment. And I think
the key thing is replication of questions.
And then, yes.
Because we did have the census, actually.
But that was in August and this was in November.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, he's right. No, he's right. There wasn't much going on then.
Okay. Yes. I actually think that...
Surprisingly.
I do need to call the discussion to an end. There hopefully will be an opportunity for you to pick the brains of the two presenters afterwards. I want to thank the IPGA staff that have helped to organise the event. They always do an absolutely excellent job, but I also want to give you an opportunity to thank Jack and Mark again for the very interesting presentation.